we can have your attention, we're going to try to get started. We've got 3 plenary sessions this afternoon that are very exciting. Okay, this session is a little bit different than we've done. We have a national priority, which we'll be talking about tomorrow on Capitol Hill, the MODDERN Cures Act, as well as we have an issue that we've been working on for the last year and a half, PDUFA, which won't be our ask for Tuesday, but we've been working through many coalitions to support not only PDUFA, but other bills that are part of PDUFA. And the issue has been very on Congress's minds last month because they're both now working on marking up versions of the bill in the House and the Senate. We've been working with our colleagues at Pharma to put ads. This CQ today went to every member of Congress, and it has an ad of our pals in Alabama highlighting living with ALS. So it's one of those coalition issues that doesn't really kind of part of our ask, but it's part of what we do all year round. So we wanted to educate you on that too, because there have been many questions about what's in PDUFA, what are some of the bills that can help us. So today we have 2 great speakers. The first speaker is Mark Booten from the National Health Council. We're a member of the National Health Council, the ALS Association is, and it's a coalition of voluntary health agencies throughout the U.S. That works together on a number of issues, and part of which are government relation issues. And we also have a great speaker named Mike Woody, who used to work for Senator Harkin. His bio is on your table, and he'll be explaining part of the Prescription Drug User-Fee Act, also known as PDUFA. So Mark?
Before I get going, I just want to take a moment and thank Steve for his leadership within the patient advocacy community. You all know the great work he does for people with ALS, but he has been a leader within other patient organizations. At the National Health Council, we are an umbrella organization that includes more than 50 patient advocacy organizations. And Steve just completed his tenure chairing the government relation groups of all 50 patient advocacy organizations. And he's been a stalwart in helping to push the council to press for policy issues that will help spur the development of new treatments. So if you join me in giving him a round of applause before we So I'm going to speak to you today on an issue that is important to all people with chronic conditions. One of the things I like to say is that people with chronic conditions want access to what exists, but we want you to make it better. We are not satisfied with the status quo, and we want better treatments. And really, this initiative is designed to help us figure out how we can get to a place of better treatments. Steve alluded to the council being an umbrella organization of patient advocacy organizations. We only work on issues that are systemic. So access to care, appropriations for health research, the development of new treatments. Those are the public policy issues we work on, where all the patient groups come together and determine what they'd like to address as a community. What's exciting when you have 50 patient advocacy organizations asking for the same thing, it's very hard for Congress to say no to that. Today, we're going to talk about the MODDERN Cures Act, and it really has its roots in a meeting that happened by the chief medical officers of all the patient groups that came together about 6 years ago. Now, they meet periodically at the National Health Council, and this was at the point where we had doubled their appropriations for NIH. And I think many of the patient groups actually cut their teeth in advocacy on asking for doubling of funding for NIH. And I think we assumed that once we accomplished that we would open the floodgates and would get new treatments. Now, a lot of terrific things have come from doubling the funding of NIH, but what we did not see was an immediate impact on the development of treatments. And the slide that you have here shows a couple of colors ramping up between 1995 and 2005. That represents the investment in the development of new treatments. It includes funding that is public, NIH, AHRQ, CDC, Department of Defense, but it also includes the private sector, both pharmaceutical, biologic, diagnostic, device, and it includes the not-for-profit sector. Our sector combined provides more than $1 billion annually for the development of new treatments. The challenge is the line that you see zigzagging through that are the number of approvals at FDA. And what you see is that's declining. It's counterintuitive to what we all expected. We thought if we increased dramatically the investment in the development of new treatments, we were going to get new treatments at the end of the process. And what we're finding is we're not getting new treatments, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But the chief medical officers asked the National Health Council to do some research to figure out what were the barriers, why were we not achieving these treatments, and to figure out how we could solve those significant barriers. Now, I can tell you in our research, which included going to NIH, members of Congress, FDA, we went to Europe, we went to other countries, we went to pharmaceutical, we went to academics, trying to identify what were the barriers and what were the potential solutions that had some political saliency. In other words, things that we could accomplish to make significant changes that would make it more likely we would get treatments for unmet medical needs. We identified 4 specific issues that were solvable, that would have meaningful impact for all people with chronic conditions, and that would have the political will to be accomplished. And I'm going to run through those 4 issues, but the first one has in particular emphasis, I think, on conditions in the neurologic, autoimmune, and cancer space, and rare disease space. The first one has to do with the fact that if you've got a great new medicine and you want to develop it, it has to have a strong patent. So I'd like to ask, just by show of hands, how many people are aware that you need a patent in order to develop a medicine? I see quite a few hands. Most people have some familiarity with that. The challenge is that as many as 80 to 90% of new promising medicines don't qualify for a patent. Think about that for a minute. 80 to 90%. That means these medicines are never developed. They're never commercialized. They never make it to the market. If you speak with researchers from NIH, they'll tell you, you know what? This great science makes so much sense, and we're seeing great implications for people with chronic disease, but we can't get a company to develop it or commercialize it because it doesn't qualify for a patent. When you speak with pharmaceutical companies, they will tell you that when people bring great new ideas for new medicines to them, they review them to see if they make sense for the market. The first thing they do is they look at whether or not they have a strong patent. And in that first round of decision making, 80 to 90% of the medicines are dismissed, not because the science is not promising, but because the patents are weak. From a patient perspective, this makes no sense. And you see the 2 girls on this slide. They're from a family called the Hempels. These 2 twins have a rare disease that in essence is like an Alzheimer's disease for children. It strikes kids when they're about 3. By the time they are 6 or 7, they're usually dead. And at that point in time, they've lost all their motor skills, their cognitive skills. These 2 girls actually had gotten to the point where they could not walk. They had stopped talking and communicating. Their parents found a compound that had been tested in mice that stopped the progression of the disease. Problem is, it can't get a patent. They've actually formed their own biotech company to develop the medicine. They're working with the FDA. These girls are being infused with the medicine in the back of their neck on a weekly basis. Since they've been getting the medicine, they've actually started walking again and communicating. So not only has it stopped the progression of the disease, it seems to be showing signs of reversing it. Now, it's a rare disease, so there are not many kids with this condition, but they've identified other conditions globally who are now getting the medicine. This has incredible implications for Alzheimer's, even heart disease, because it works on the plaques in the body. No company will develop it or commercialize it because there's no patent. There are countless medicines that fall into this category, not being developed. There's a similar issue, and that is if you have a condition that is difficult to figure out the mechanisms of action, I would say ALS certainly qualifies. You look at Alzheimer's, for example. Many of the neurologic autoimmune cancer conditions, and certainly a lot of rare diseases. If the condition is slow progression, it's going to take a long time to develop the medicine and actually bring it to market. In Alzheimer's, it's not uncommon for that to take 12, 18 years. And the challenge with that is your patent runs concurrently with that development process. Patents only last 20 years. So if the patent lasts 20 years and it takes you 15 to 18 years to develop it, you can't get it to market before your patent expires. And so we see companies saying, we're not going to go into this space. It takes too much time, too much money to develop the product to bring it to market. And then we have no patent to protect it from generic competition. And in fact, several large companies have said, we're moving out of the brain space because it takes too long and we can't get a return on the investment. Again, makes no sense from a patient perspective. And so MODDERN Cures addresses this in two ways. It creates a new class of drugs called dormant therapies. And dormant therapies basically mean you will treat a condition with an unmet need. An unmet need means a condition without an effective treatment or a treatment that improves health outcomes. Certainly ALS would qualify as an unmet medical need and certainly as a dormant therapy. What the bill does is it provides protection to the product from generic entry for a period of time that runs from the date of approval. So if you have a compound that can't be patented, you can bring it through this pathway as a dormant therapy, have it approved, have it come to market, and for a period of time it is sold without generic competition, and then generics enter the market and the prices come down. The timing of that period runs at the point of approval, not during the development time. So you don't run into the situation where medicines are actually being dropped because they're running out of patent life. This actually would allow the science to drive the development of medicines, not patent law, which makes no sense when you're trying to address unmet medical needs. Huge opportunity to spur the development of treatments in a very targeted area for all the people that we represent, whether it be with ALS or other chronic conditions without effective treatments. So that's the first barrier. The second barrier has to do with personalized medicine. Many people are familiar that we mapped the genome now more than 11 years ago. And everybody thought that we would get these personalized medical treatments that they would follow and people would just be able to give their genetics to a company and then figure out exactly what sort of treatments would be most appropriate for them. That has really not happened. And in fact, at this point in time, there's only a small number of treatments that are actually tailored to a specific subpopulation. And the challenge with this, and here's how it relates to people with ALS, is that increasingly we're finding that a treatment works for a small subset of the population. And in fact, on average, medicines only work about 60% of the time. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. 40% of the time they don't work, even for very common medicines like Lipitor. But when you start to look at unmet needs, you look at oncology, they often work only 15 or 10%. And the challenge is, how do you differentiate the population for whom the medicine works for safely and effectively? What we've found is some medicines will work for a very small percent of the population, but they're not approved at the FDA because they have side effects for the larger population for whom they're not effective. And so a lot of medicines never come to market, even though there's a small population they work for. The person in the picture is Richard. Richard is a gentleman that had lung cancer. He had lung cancer now for about 9 years. He's a family man, has some children, wife. He's actually had one lung removed. He's had tumors removed from his brain twice. And recently he had tumors develop on the remaining lung. You know, that is the worst case scenario for somebody with lung cancer because you're running out of options. He, as it turned out, happened to have the right genetic makeup so that he would respond to a medicine that was put out on the market recently for lung cancer. It only worked for 3% of the population, but they developed a diagnostic to figure out who that 3% was. He happens to be in that 3%, he's now in remission. That medicine would not have come to market if there had not been a companion diagnostic. Now the challenge with that is diagnostics are expensive to develop. And our whole system of reimbursement is predicated on giving a medicine to the entire class of people, not just the people who it will work for. And so our marketplace is not aligned appropriately. And the challenge is, how do you incentivize the development of these companion diagnostics so you know when you take a medicine it's going to work for you? So MODDERN Cures addresses that issue, and it does it this way. It says if you're going to develop a medicine and you're willing to also fund the development of a companion diagnostic that predicts who the medicine will work for safely and effectively, we'll extend the time you can market that product by 6 months to a year from generic competition. We're still going to allow generic competition because we want the prices to come down. But that 6 months to a year, but according to a number of economists and the pharmaceutical and diagnostic industry, will double or triple the investment in the development of diagnostics and actually move us towards an era of personalized medicine and ensure that medicines at the FDA are approved if they in fact do work for a subset of the population, which is incredibly important. Third issue has to do with the fact that once these diagnostics are approved by the FDA, there's often a really long lag time before we have access to them. And in fact, built into the structure of creating codes for diagnostics that allow a provider to be reimbursed. So if your doctor orders the diagnostic for that doctor to be reimbursed for that, actually takes 15 months. So at the very outset, there's at least a 15-month time lag, and in many other instances, it can be longer. And one of the best known advanced diagnostics is the HER2 breast cancer test. This is the test that women take if they have breast cancer, and the reason is there's a medicine that if you have a certain kind of breast cancer, you can take, and it greatly reduces your recurrence of breast cancer. And what this slide shows is it took in total 11 years to bring this test to market. And in fact, once it was approved by the FDA, it took nearly 5 years before a code was given to the test. So think about that for a minute. The medicine that would prolong the lives of these women with breast cancer was available and on the market. It had a huge cost to the system, huge out-of-pocket cost to the woman with breast cancer, but it also had huge side effects. And so for nearly 5 years, women had to roll the dice and decide whether or not to take the medicine without the test, which meant that a lot of women did not take the medicine, and as a result had a recurrence of breast cancer, and a lot of women took it who didn't need it. It made absolutely no sense. Now there are good reasons why creating the codes takes a long time, and I won't go into any great detail due to time for that, but there's no good reason to deny somebody access to a test that would help them make a good decision about how to treat their own health. And so the solution in the bill is to allow a temporary code for these kinds of tests to be utilized until the coding process is complete. It's somewhat imperfect and simple, but it would allow a woman to have access to a HER2 breast cancer test while it's going through the coding process. Again, absolutely no reason not to do this. The fourth and final issue that MODDERN Cures addresses is reimbursement for these advanced diagnostics. And something I should have said at the very beginning that I want to be really clear about, we identified a lot of problems and barriers within the development of new treatments. And I want to be very upfront with that. This bill only addresses 4 that we think are particularly impactful and also doable in this political climate. There are other things that we need to do, but these are just 4. So I don't want you to think that I am saying this will solve all our problems, but it will go a long ways towards developing of new treatments. The last barrier, again, with reimbursement for diagnostics, in the spirit of saving time, I won't explain how reimbursement currently works, but I will tell you that it was frozen in time in 1984 as a cost containment mechanism. And what happens now is new diagnostics are referred to what existed in 1984. You find out what was most closely alike, and that sets your reimbursement rate, which means that most tests are paid pennies on the dollar. So a very complicated test, like a HER2 breast cancer test, which takes hundreds of millions of dollars to develop, if it's compared to a test that exists in 1984, it's going to get a very, very low reimbursement rate. Makes no sense. And so what we do in the bill is we say to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, you can consider other factors. The impact on a patient's quality of life, the impact on the system by getting the right care to the right person because you're only giving the medicine to the person for whom it will work. Cost savings as a result of that. If you want, you can consider those factors and provide a higher reimbursement mechanism. Again, imperfect. What we didn't want to do is simply increase the cost of all diagnostics, but for those that are revolutionary, for those that truly target care to the right individual, they should be reimbursed at a larger or higher level, and this allows it. The last thing I'll tell you about in this bill is that in this environment, you have to be very conscious of cost. And we've got a lot of issues around budget and taxes and looking at deficits that are being discussed in this town. And nobody wants to do anything that's going to have any significant cost. So we structured this bill and we had a cost analysis that shows over 10 years, this bill only cost $20 million. So it's a very low cost bill. And again, it has great political saliency for developing new treatments. Again, you don't need to know all the specifics of the bill, but as you make your ask, what you need to do is, and Steve I'm sure has told you this repeatedly, tell your story, and simply say that MODDERN Cures is something that can help us develop the treatments that we need, and this is something we support. And I look forward to the Q&A, so thank you.
We have time right now for one or two questions. Any questions?
You were talking about reimbursement. In some states, are there laws that require insurance companies to cover reimbursement for those type of drugs that you're referring to for things like cancer, drugs that are in trial phases or maybe in a developmental phase one like you're talking about?
With slightly different issues. So if you have medicines that are in clinical development, there used to be a point in time where if you were in a clinical trial, for example, on a new medicine, your insurance could drop you for your coverage. That was changed in a lot of states, in particular for cancer, and then with health reform, that was changed as well. So that is no longer a barrier. What this really is saying is that these medicines that will never come to market because they don't have a patent now have a pathway to come to market. And what's exciting about that is it focuses us in on medicines that treat unmet medical needs, because other medicines will not qualify for this pathway. So it forces the industry to look in a different area. With the diagnostics, the mechanism for reimbursement is really set at the federal level. It's implemented at a regional level, but there's no real variation in terms of the state laws on that because it's largely controlled by federal. But the clinical trial stuff, you're absolutely right, and unfortunately that was recently changed in health reform and has now been implemented.
Another question? Of course.
Actually, that's a terrific question. Thank you. Sure, I will. The question is, when I talk about the challenges with patents, are we talking about therapies that have not come to market or therapies that are on the market? And it's a terrific question because there's something called repurposing of drugs. And there's two aspects to that. One is to repurpose a drug or potential medicine that never came to market. And so you'll see many compounds. In fact, for every compound the FDA approves and actually makes it to market, approximately 10,000 don't. Those compounds go on the shelf, and they rarely get looked at again because the patent clock is ticking down. They're no longer of value. But then you have medicines that are on the market that could be repurposed for a new indication. We looked at both issues. Dormant therapies is limited only to medicines that have never come to market. And the reason for that is we use as a mechanism to incentivize that something called data exclusivity, which prevents generics from entering the market for a period of time. If you did that to medicines that were already on the market, you'd never get a generic equivalent. And so the prices would stay high. What we're hoping to do is to reallocate existing monies, existing federal dollars, that are currently used to develop dormant therapies. So for example, NIH is working on a drug for mental health, and they're doing clinical randomized double-blind trials currently, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's a medicine that's a dormant therapy. It's not on the market, and it will never come to market. What I'd rather see is that money spent on existing products that are on the market that could be repurposed for new indications. But our mechanism would prohibit generic entry, and that's okay when it first enters the market, but if you do it once a product is on the market, the prices never come down. And part of our rationale was, let's spur the development of new treatments, but let's make sure the prices come down. Great question.
One more question.
I have 2 questions. So you get to choose which one you want to answer, I guess. So when the very last slide you had, which is the cost is only $20 million. So do you have the cost of not passing? What that would be? And the second question I have is, let's say we changed healthcare providing, so we have a single payer system rather than continuing to have private insurance companies who seem to be controlling the marketplace. Would that make a difference?
Interesting questions. So I'll do them both as quickly as I can. The first question in terms of, I'm trying to think of how to frame that. I'm stumbling over how to respond to the first question, but in terms of let me go back to the insurance market. The insurance market, if you changed it, I'm not sure that it would make a difference or not, because right now the private sector really wants to have medicines that address unmet medical needs, and they recognize our current system actually encourages industry to take an existing medicine, make a small change to it, and by making a small change, it might last an hour longer, which is not a bad thing. It's really good for adherence and compliance. But they will then get a new patent, and they can protect it for 20 years. But if you develop a medicine for ALS, you're lucky if you have 2-3 years left of patent life at the end of it. So we're not incentivizing the right thing. So the insurance market likes that. The insurance market loves the idea of incentivizing companion diagnostics, because then you only give the medicine to the person it works for. So the insurance companies are with us currently, so I'm not sure that that would shift. In terms of the doing the allocation of what we're losing by not having this, I don't think that we have the capacity to do that. I think that is infinite. When you start to look at quality of life, just the care costs, the caring cost of family caregivers, lost productivity, it's sort of on a magnitude that I don't know that we can fathom. Having said that, I will say that the cost we put up there is based on what's called Congressional Budget Office rules. They have certain rules as to how they score this. They do not score savings based on getting the right care to the right person. So this does not include savings. It only includes the actual costs to the FDA, NIH for developing these drugs, and the cost of providing the drugs through public programs. That's over 10 years for 20 million, exactly. Yeah. So it's a very low cost, and what we typically say is virtually no cost to the government, but a huge opportunity to actually drive the development of new treatments and actually save the system money. And when the insurance companies are standing up behind you saying, yeah, this will save money, that's a pretty good indication that CBO is not scoring it correctly. Just my view.
Hopefully we're going to have some more time for questions. Mike, up there.
I have a question. How long will the protection period be for drugs that are developed?
And that's a terrific question. We, in the House version, they have used the same number that was original under what's called the Hatch-Waxman that created generics, and that's 15 years. There's a debate on that. The patient community has said it has to be long enough to create the incentives to develop the medicines, But we've been sort of silent, and the reason for that is I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all that's appropriate for all medicines. In other words, some medicines, like developing a treatment for ALS, is more complicated than other conditions, and it requires longer periods of time, longer investment. Other conditions may be less costly. The challenge is you have to put some number in the bill, and so we've said we leave that to you, Congress. In the House, they're talking about 15. In the Senate, some are talking 15, some are talking 10. So it really depends. Ultimately, it will work its way through the House and the Senate. They'll come together in committee and decide what is that number. But it probably has to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 years to work, because we know there are certain mechanisms that can provide, for example, under rare diseases, you get 7. And we've seen some great advances for rare diseases, but when you factor in that there are more than 7,500 rare diseases, and we've only accomplished about 350 treatments, it hasn't worked at the level we would all like. And typically for a medicine to really get investment, they're looking for something in the magnitude of 12 to 15 years of protection. Good question. Thank you.
My name is Mike Woody. I am a partner in a small public policy government affairs group here in Washington, and Steve was kind enough to ask me to come and talk to you about PDUFA. Unfortunately, he asked me to do it after lunch, and the Prescription Drug User Fee Act is a surefire way to put people to sleep, so I will try very hard to make this as interesting as possible, and in fact, I'll go to the second slide first. First, I want to ask you all to think about what the FDA actually is. You probably have some kind of picture in your head of what the FDA actually regulates. An easy way to think of it probably is what you did when you woke up this morning. You, if you're like most people, use some sort of cosmetic, shampoo or something like that. You probably also used, if you're like most people, a prescription drug. You may have used a medical device. You may have fed an animal this morning. And if you're a smoker, you may have actually had a cigarette. And if you did that, you also did something that is regulated by the FDA. The FDA regulates about 25% of the US economy, which is actually a pretty stunning number if you think about it. It is also one of the smallest regulatory agencies for that kind of impact that you could imagine. The actual appropriated resources for the FDA is around $2.2 billion. And we throw around billions in Washington a lot, but that's not very much. The FDA augments its budget through user fees from various industries, including the drug and device industry, and those fees end up totaling about another $1.5 billion. So the FDA in total, with about 10,000 employees and a very, very significant regulatory mandate, operates on under $4 billion. It's not very big. But they have huge responsibilities, and I want to talk to you about the drug review part of what the FDA does. Without a smooth functioning FDA that's efficient, applications for new medical products, including drugs and devices, will be incredibly slow getting through the approval process. Drugs and devices are different than lots of other products that FDA regulates, or lots of other products that enter into interstate commerce. For example, I mentioned dog food earlier. You can, if you are a small company, produce a new type of dog food and sell that into interstate commerce immediately. You, as a small biotech company, cannot produce a new drug or biologic product and introduce that into interstate commerce immediately. You have to have it reviewed first for safety and efficacy by the Food and Drug Administration. So in many ways, the FDA can be a barrier to access for that product for patients. So what I want to talk to you about, and this is where the Prescription Drug User Fee Act comes into play, is sort of the intersection between that aspect of what the FDA does, the review of medical products, and how the agency is funded and why that matters to you. Beginning in the late 80s, it's hard to remember now, but HIV was something that was rampant in specific communities in the US. And there was a great deal of concern within the HIV/AIDS community that there were not promising new products coming out of the drug industry and being reviewed by the FDA quickly enough. There were no treatment options. And the fear was very, very acute. The HIV community, as well as other patient advocacy organizations, Congress, as well as the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA, looked at the problem, and what they realized was that the FDA review process, part of the issue here was that it was too slow. And if you look at this slide, you can see review timelines in 1990. And you will see that for a product to be reviewed, for a new drug to be reviewed at the FDA, it took about 2.5 years. That's a great deal of time. And the issue there was that the FDA did not have the requisite number or type of staff that they needed to review new drug applications quickly enough. So they needed some new ways to fund themselves, to hire up the appropriate staff that they needed, and to figure out how they could drive review timelines down. Because again, to the extent that a new drug application is sitting at the agency, the product is not on the market and cannot be utilized by patients and cannot be prescribed by physicians. So we get to the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and basically this was a deal between the FDA and between the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry agreed to pay fees to the agency. These are application fees that when you submit a new drug application, you pay a certain amount of money, and that goes to the agency, and the agency can use it for specific things. Primarily, they use the money to fund drug reviewers and the human drug review function at the agency. So it's those employees at the agency, their training, their backgrounds that actually review the products that eventually get onto the market. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act funds currently around 2,000 employees at the agency. Congress reauthorizes this program once every 5 years. To the extent that Congress does not reauthorize this program, those employees get RIF notices and are actually let go. And if that happens, human drug review at the agency and the new drug approval process grinds completely to a halt. So this is the year that we reauthorized the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. It's actually a pretty interesting legislative process from a congressional perspective because Congress does not often look at FDA-related bills. Usually they save them for just this 5-year reauthorization period. And so Congress typically looks at this as an opportunity to examine the FDA and its authorities from top to bottom and make lots of changes in areas, frankly, that have nothing to do with the user fees themselves. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. For example, this time around, Congress is particularly interested in improving the way in which FDA regulates foreign sources of active pharmaceutical ingredient or finished product that come into the U.S., the so-called upstream supply chain, and securing that. You may remember reading about the heparin scare in 2007 and 2008 that killed about 60 people in the U.S. Congress has long been interested in securing the supply chain, both on the drug side as well as on the food side, and has taken a lot of time and effort over the last several years to improve FDA's capabilities. So this is one example of something that Congress adds as part of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act process. But there are some other issues at play as well. There are other user fee agreements that ride along with PDUFA at the same time. The Medical Device User Fee Act also rides along at the same time. It does the exact same sort of thing for the medical device industry. and the patients that it serves. There are lots of new members of Congress this time around. You may remember the election in 2010 swept in a whole bunch of new members of Congress, particularly those that were very critical of the size of government in general. So one of the tasks of the patient advocacy community, as well as the pharmaceutical industry, the medical device industry, and others who are interested in this program, is making sure that those folks understand that without those user fees, funding those employees at the FDA, that there are real significant impacts to the patient community if the industry can't keep developing new products. And I think what I'll do is actually mention one last thing, and that's the presidential election year politics as well. This has become less of an issue than probably everybody who examines this thought 6 months ago. It is extremely difficult to pass anything in Congress these days, as you probably have read or seen on television. And considering that it's a presidential election year, politics is even more at the forefront of everything that is moving. And FDA issues are not without their own political problems. But I will say this, Congress is taking this bill extremely seriously. The Energy and Commerce Committee on the House side, who has jurisdiction over the FDA, passed this bill out of committee last week, 46 to nothing, which is actually an extremely odd event for those that follow the Energy and Commerce Committee, like my friend Adam Gluck back there. And the Senate is getting ready to take up the bill on the Senate floor, probably either late this week or early next week. So the bill is moving right along, and that's a very, very good sign. And we are going to be following it very, very closely until passage. Congress has to pass the bill by September 30th. If they don't, then the funding stream runs out, and as I said before, the human drug review function at the FDA slows down dramatically, which is something that everybody would like to avoid. And I'll be happy to take any questions about PDUFA and why it's important to you all, either up here or I can sit.
Any questions?
Yes, ma'am. I don't know the specific issue that you're dealing with. The FDA does not do the research and development on the drugs themselves. In other words,
I'm not saying research and development, I'm testing.
Right, nor do they do that. The companies are responsible for the clinical trials. The FDA has a great deal of oversight over the clinical trial process. From the very beginning, when a company files an investigative new drug application, that's a notification to the agency that they want to begin to test a promising compound in human subjects. They discuss that with the agency, the trial design, etc., before they begin testing. And the FDA has several meetings along the way during phase 1, 2, and 3 of the clinical trial process with companies, but the companies are fully responsible for running those trials, paying for those trials, gathering the safety and efficacy data in those trials, and then submitting that data to the FDA in a new drug application.
Okay. So I think I've made my statement correctly, and that work really wasn't done. The paperwork was submitted, it was approved by the FDA, and there were several examples of that. And there was a lot of, I thought, there was a lot of bad publicity about it, and you know, it was pointed for the FDA for not doing their homework before they approved it.
I'm not familiar with the specific case that you're talking about. Oftentimes, not oftentimes, sometimes, there will be criticism of the agency for approving a product that some people think that they should not, based on the risk-benefit calculation that the FDA used. And one of the things in the Prescription Drug User Fee Act that's going through this time is actually a standardization of the way that FDA considers risk and benefit and the way that they review products, so that it will be clear, more clear to people why they took the action that they did. And I'll tell you why that's important from a patient advocacy perspective too. Folks with ALS, folks with late-stage cancer are much more likely to accept a level of risk that is higher than those that, say, have a migraine. And that's appropriate. And the FDA, though, has not been able to standardize the way that they look at data over multiple applications in lots of different therapeutic areas. And so that has led to criticism over time, particularly from consumer groups who are, rightly so, concerned about patient safety. And so the agency wants to pay as close attention as they can to how they make those decisions to minimize some of the second guessing that comes out. And those types of criticisms can also become very political too, with Congress as well, looking at what the agency does. But I'm sorry, I'm just not as familiar with the specific thing that you're referring to.
I think that the issue that you're talking about probably relates to some of the other countries where the review process is actually outsourced, in particular in the diagnostic space. And so we have seen issues in Europe and other places where there's been criticism of that. And not too long ago there was discussion of whether or not that should happen here. That is now part of the agreement, but I suspect that is the issue that you may be thinking about.
I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, though I find it hard to believe in this regard. New drug applications are hundreds of thousands of pages long, and they are not really fakeable, if you follow me. But in any event.
Well, that's good, because that just makes all this harder.
Great, thank you. Do we have one more question? Okay, great. Well, thank you all.